Hello and welcome back to the Jim Green Footwear channel. In today's video we're going to be covering one of our most frequently asked questions, and that is, what is the difference between our stock African Ranger and our barefoot African Ranger? Just a few points to cover before we jump into the comparison of both of these great boots. Something to note is that both styles of African Ranger are included in our Boots for Rangers program. For those of you that don't know about the program, we are in collaboration with the Game Rangers Association of Africa to put boots on rangers in need. And for every 10 pairs of the African Ranger boot that we sell, we donate a pair to rangers in need. As of the moment, we have about 800 pairs of boots that are needing to be allocated to rangers. They're currently going through the factory, but we'll have more information on that boot drop coming soon. Another point to briefly touch on before we move into our comparison is the new leathers and colorways coming to the African Ranger. These boots are going through the factory and are on their way to America, and you can expect those pre-orders to be dispatched by the end of February. Thank you to everyone who has supported our pre-sale on all these styles. We can't wait to hear the feedback once these boots hit your feet and you head off on the journeys ahead. So now that we've got the admin out of the way, let's jump into the comparison of these two styles. And we'll kick things off with the similarities. The first similarity that you'll notice is that the upper construction is exactly the same. And you can notice this in our toe cap, reinforced facing, and our padded collar ankle support. The reason for pulling through these similarities on both of the styles is that we found that there are key specs to our African Ranger. For example, the addition of the toe cap on both of the boots means that when you are walking through the bush and kicking rocks along the way, your toe is able to take a bit more of a beating having that extra layer of leather. Although our upper construction is exactly the same between the two boots, there are very huge differences between the two styles. So now let's jump into those differences and see exactly what makes this a barefoot boot and what makes this our stock African Ranger. The first difference to touch on between these two styles is the last used for each of these boots. Our stock African Ranger makes use of our STC last. This is a wide-fitting last and offers a roomy and rounded toe box, which means more room above the toes. And now having a look at the barefoot Ranger, this uses our zero drop last. The two lasts are fairly similar, however, the barefoot last does have a slightly more wider fitting feel to it. Another difference that you'll notice between these two lasts is that on our barefoot African Ranger, the zero drop last, there is no toe spring. Where on our stock African Ranger, which uses our STC last as mentioned, you will find a toe spring in the boot. Our next difference between these two styles has us moving down to the toe box. You'll notice on our barefoot African Ranger that there is no toe puff, whereas in our stock African Ranger, there is a toe puff. The difference between these two specs can be easily spotted by simply pressing down on the toe box of these two styles. Looking at our barefoot Ranger, when pressed down on the toe, it is flexible and soft out the box, where our stock African Ranger is slightly more rigid and will take a bit of time to break into the foot. Our next difference, which isn't visible to the eye as it is an interior spec of the boot, is that we have removed the steel shank from our stock African Ranger. By removing our steel shank, it adds to that barefoot flexible feel of the boot that we were trying to achieve. Now slowly moving down the upper of the boot, we get to our next change, which is in the midsole. Having a look at our stock African Ranger, we make use of a polyester woven fiberboard, where our barefoot African Ranger makes use of a leather midsole with a resin runner. We've had many questions as to why there's a resin runner applied to the leather midsole, and this just has to do with the adhesive sticking of the sole. Now that we've had a look at the upper differences and the midsole differences, that leaves one last component, which is our sole. And for us, this was one of the most exciting specs to work on for this boot, as it was a collaboration with Rose ANVIL. The Rose ANVIL team have also done a great video on our barefoot African Ranger boot, and we'll pop up a link over here for you guys to go and have a look. We would seriously recommend it. Checking it out if you're considering getting a pair of these. He goes into great depth about this boot in terms of sizing, fit, what you can experience out of the box, and just the overall feel of our barefoot African Ranger. Our ANVIL sole, which is featured on the barefoot Ranger, does make use of a slightly softer compound compared to that of our Ringo sole. So this does mean that your barefoot boots will probably see a few more resoles in their lifetime compared to the stock African Ranger. But as we mentioned earlier, this was all a purpose in achieving our barefoot feel for the boot. So now that we've covered all the spec changes between these two boots and we understand the styles a bit better, what can you expect to feel different between these two boots? Point number one touches on the break-in time between these two styles. And it goes without saying that of course our barefoot boot has close to no break-in time out of the box. Where our stock African Ranger, you can experience a slightly longer break-in time due to our steel shank and the extra support specs around the boot. So if you do own a pair of these or are planning on getting a pair, what we recommend is that you put them on and wear them around the house for a few nights before you head out on the longer adventures in the bush. The next point comes in the feel underfoot because of the sole choices. As we've mentioned throughout this whole video, we've tried to achieve that barefoot feel with our African Ranger, and that comes in with the sole and the leather midsole. So when you're traversing through the bush, you're going to feel those twigs, you're going to feel those rocks, and you're really going to get a good understanding for the terrain that you are hiking on. Where our stock African Ranger gives you that little bit extra more support when going up that steeper mountain or the rocky terrain. As we can tell, there are benefits to both styles. It all just depends on what your preference is and what you are looking for on your hike. If you're looking for the feeling underfoot and understanding your terrain a bit better and maybe not a strenuous hike, we would recommend our African Ranger in the barefoot edition. Where if you need that little bit extra more support, the terrain is a little bit more demanding, we would recommend our stock African Ranger. In wrapping up, and we understand that it's a lot of information to take in one, we're going to give a brief breakdown of what we have just covered between these two styles. Looking at the Barefoot Ranger, we've said it multiple times throughout the video, but what we wanted to achieve was that true barefoot feel. Feeling the rocks underfoot, feeling the twigs underfoot, understanding the terrain that you're traversing, and getting a real good feel for the ground under feet. The stock African Ranger offers slightly more support, possessing a steel shank, the toe puff, and the slightly more firm Oringo wedge sole. So this brings us to the end of our Barefoot African Ranger versus our stock African Ranger. We hope that we've covered all the questions that you guys were wanting to know about these two different styles, and we hope that this video makes the choice a lot easier between choosing the stock or barefoot style. If there's any points that we've missed on these two styles that you're looking to know, please go ahead and drop it down in the comments down below. We do understand that there's some questions that we could be missing out on in this breakdown, and asking them down below could assist a customer in getting the right style on their feet. Thank you so much everyone for tuning in once again to the Jim Green journey. We'll see you all next week for another video, and if you've liked this one, please go ahead and drop a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you all next week. Cheers.